It had been 4 long years since my husband, Thomas, disappeared in the mountains. Every day felt the same, quiet, empty, and full of questions I'd never been able to answer. But this morning was different. I was pouring my usual cup of coffee when I noticed a dog standing at the edge of the porch. He wasn't just any dog. His eyes seemed to carry a message, and in his mouth he held something that made my heart stop. A blue jacket. Not just any jacket, Thomas's jacket. My hands shook as I opened the door. Where, where did you get that? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The dog stepped closer, dropped the jacket at my feet, and stared up at me like he knew something I didn't. In that moment I knew. This wasn't over. The morning air was thick with fog, curling around the edges of the porch like an unspoken secret. I could still hear the faint sound of the coffee brewing in the kitchen as I stood frozen, staring at the dog on the porch. He was large, a shepherd mix with fur that looked like it had braved years of weather. His intelligent amber eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, carrying a depth of emotion that made my chest tighten. But it wasn't the dog that stopped me in my tracks. It was the jacket, a weathered blue jacket, frayed at the edges but undeniably familiar. Thomas's jacket, the one he wore the day he vanished. My hands trembled as I pushed open the screen door. "Where did you find this?" I asked, my voice cracking. The dog didn't flinch. He moved closer, dropping the jacket at my feet as if it was some kind of offering. Memories came rushing back. Thomas's smile as he pulled on that very jacket, his promise to be home before sunset, the frantic search that followed, helicopters and rescue teams scouring the mountains, only to come back empty-handed. The dog sat down, his mission seemingly complete. But I wasn't done. I crouched, picking up the jacket with trembling hands. As I did, a small piece of paper fluttered to the ground. My breath caught as I unfolded it. The ink was faded, water-streaked, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "My dearest Ellen, if you're reading this, I'm in trouble. Followed the wrong trail. Cave system. Deeper than I thought. Coordinates. I love you, always." Tears blurred my vision. The jacket smelled faintly of Thomas, earth, decay, and the sandalwood cologne he wore on our last anniversary. The dog whined softly, nudging my hand. The jacket felt heavier in my hands than it should have, burdened with the weight of memories and questions. My mind raced. Thomas's handwriting, his message. It wasn't just a clue, it was a lifeline, fragile but undeniable. The dog sat patiently, his amber eyes unwavering. It felt like he was waiting for me to act, to take the next step. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking as I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name, Peter Martinez. Peter had been the lead detective when Thomas disappeared. He'd retired now, but he told me to call if I ever needed anything, and I needed answers. The phone rang 4 times before his gravelly voice picked up. "Ellen, everything okay?" "The jacket, Peter," I said, my words tumbling out. "Someone found Thomas's jacket." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind that makes your heart sink. Finally, he said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes." As I waited, I couldn't stop turning the jacket over in my hands, inspecting every pocket, every frayed edge. It was worn but intact. No tears, no blood, nothing to suggest the worst. Inside, I found little remnants of Thomas's life, a granola bar wrapper, his old compass, and the chapstick he always carried. The dog sat nearby, watching me with that same quiet intensity. "Who are you?" I whispered. "Where did you come from?" He tilted his head at my words, almost as if he understood. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence. Peter had arrived. I opened the door. The jacket clutched tightly to my chest. "Peter, look at this," I said, holding it out. He studied it carefully, his brow furrowing. "Ellen, this jacket hasn't been out there for 4 years. It's too well preserved." "What are you saying?" Peter glanced at the dog, then back at me. "I think we need to follow him." Peter grabbed his jacket and I laced up my hiking boots. The dog stood by the door, his tail wagging softly as if he knew we were ready. My heart raced, not with fear, but with a strange sense of anticipation. 4 years of unanswered questions, of mourning an empty casket, and now there was a thread to pull. The dog led the way, his pace steady and purposeful. The dense woods swallowed us whole, the towering trees casting shadows that danced in the dim light. Peter stayed close behind, his GPS marking our path, but I barely noticed him. My focus was entirely on the dog. He moved with such certainty, weaving through the underbrush as if he knew every inch of the terrain. It was hard to believe he was just an ordinary stray. He seemed almost deliberate. Peter broke the silence. "This is taking us toward Devil's Backbone," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "That ridge is dangerous, Ellen. Few hikers go near it." "I don't care," I said firmly, gripping Thomas's jacket tighter. "If this is where he's leading us, then we go." The morning fog had lifted, but storm clouds loomed in the distance. The air was heavy with the promise of rain. Every step we took felt like peeling back layers of a secret the forest had guarded for years. Suddenly the dog stopped. His ears perked up, his nose twitching as he veered off the main trail into a thicket of mountain laurel. Peter and I exchanged a glance before following him. In a small clearing, half hidden by overgrown vegetation, stood a rock face with a dark opening at its base. My breath caught in my throat. "This isn't on any map," Peter said, his brow furrowed. "The mining entrances were supposed to be sealed decades ago." The dog barked sharply, his voice echoing off the rock walls. He trotted to the opening and looked back at us, his amber eyes urging us forward. Peter hesitated, his flashlight illuminating the entrance. "This isn't safe, Ellen. We should wait for backup." "No," I said, stepping closer to the dark opening. "Thomas is out there, Peter. I can feel it. I'm not waiting anymore." The dog stood by the cave entrance, his tail wagging slightly as if encouraging us to follow. I glanced at Peter, who was visibly uneasy, his flashlight casting long shadows across the jagged rock face. "You don't have to come," I told him, my voice steady but firm. "But I do." Peter sighed, shaking his head. "You're as stubborn as he was," he muttered before pulling out his flashlight and stepping beside me. "All right, let's do this." The air inside the cave was cool, carrying a faint metallic tang that made me shiver. The dog moved ahead confidently, his white-tipped tail barely visible in the dim light. I followed closely, every step echoing in the narrow tunnel. The ground beneath us was uneven, scattered with loose rocks and debris. Old mining equipment lay abandoned along the walls, rusted beyond recognition. "This place feels like it's been frozen in time," Peter whispered, his voice bouncing eerily off the stone walls. As we ventured deeper, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something more than just a forgotten cave. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating, as if the mountain itself was watching us. The dog suddenly stopped, his ears perked up and his body tense. He turned toward a dark crevice in the wall, pawing at the ground and letting out a low whine. Peter shone his flashlight on the spot, revealing a small metal climbing harness buried in the dirt. My breath caught as I recognized it instantly. "This is Thomas's?" I whispered, my fingers brushing against the worn leather straps. Peter crouched beside me, inspecting the harness. "If this is here, then he was here, Ellen. Recently." The dog barked sharply, pulling our attention toward the deeper part of the cave. Without hesitation, he trotted forward, his movements urgent. "We should wait for backup," Peter said again, his tone pleading this time. "This is dangerous." But I couldn't stop now. The dog had led me here for a reason. I tightened Thomas's jacket around me and moved toward the deeper tunnel. "I'm not leaving until I know the truth." Peter reluctantly followed, muttering something about stubborn people. The tunnel narrowed, and the air grew colder. Every step felt like peeling back another layer of a mystery that had haunted me for years. In the distance, the faint sound of rushing water grew louder. The dog glanced back at me, his amber eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Determination. Maybe even hope. "Let's keep going," I said softly, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. As we moved deeper into the tunnel, the sound of rushing water grew louder, resonating off the cold stone walls. The dog led the way, his movements purposeful, his ears flicking back occasionally as if to ensure we were still following. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, and my flashlight revealed a sight that made me gasp. The walls shimmered, lined with crystal formations unlike anything I'd ever seen. They glowed faintly in the dim light, their translucent edges refracting a kaleidoscope of colors. The air was heavy with moisture, and the sound of the underground river was thunderous now, flowing somewhere just out of sight. "What is this?" Peter whispered, his voice filled with awe. I stepped forward, my geologist's mind racing. These formations were impossible. They defied everything I knew about mineral structures at this depth. Thomas had been right. This place was extraordinary. The dog padded to the far side of the chamber, where a small alcove was tucked into the rock. There, under a layer of dust, was a makeshift campsite. A tent, a desk littered with papers, a solar-powered lantern, and scientific equipment. My heart pounded as I recognized the handwriting on the scattered notes. Thomas's. "Peter, look!" I exclaimed, rushing to the desk. I picked up one of the notebooks, the familiar scrawl bringing tears to my eyes. The pages were filled with detailed observations, geological theories, and sketches of the crystals. But one entry stood out, dated just weeks ago. Day 147. The energy readings here are unlike anything I've ever seen. These crystals could revolutionize energy storage, but someone else knows. I've heard them in the upper tunnels. I have to protect this discovery, for Ellen, for the future. Peter's hand landed gently on my shoulder, grounding me as my knees threatened to buckle. He was here, Ellen, and he was working on something incredible. The dog barked, sharp and urgent, pulling my attention to a narrow passage leading away from the main chamber. His body was tense, his tail stiff, as if warning us of something ahead. We followed cautiously, our flashlights illuminating a path that led to the source of the rushing water, a massive underground river. The water churned violently, its surface glinting in the faint light from the crystals. On the far bank, another tent stood, newer and less weathered than Thomas's. "What is this?" Peter muttered, scanning the area with his flashlight. Fresh boot prints marked the sandy ground near the river. Whoever had been here wasn't far. And then we heard it, a low, ominous voice echoing from the shadows. "I was wondering when you'd show up." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. From the darkness, three figures emerged, flashlights in hand. The leader's face was cold, his smile sharp as a blade. "Welcome, Dr. Morrison. We've been expecting you." The dog growled low, positioning himself protectively between me and the strangers. My hand tightened around the jacket. The truth was finally within reach, but the danger had just begun. The leader's flashlight beam cut through the shadows, casting long, jagged shapes on the cavern walls. His sharp eyes moved from me to Peter and then to the dog, whose low growl filled the heavy silence. "You've come a long way, Dr. Morrison," the man said, his voice smooth but dripping with menace. "Your husband spoke highly of your intelligence, said you'd figure it out eventually." "Where is he?" I demanded, my voice shaking but determined. My hands clenched the jacket tightly, drawing strength from the memory of Thomas's words. The man smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Thomas? Oh, he's here. Well, nearby. But whether you'll get to see him—" He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air like a threat. The other two men shifted uneasily, their flashlights casting erratic beams on the walls. Peter stepped forward, his tone firm and authoritative. "You're trespassing on federal land. Whatever you're doing here ends now." The leader's smile didn't waver. "I admire your confidence, Detective. But let me assure you, this operation is far beyond your jurisdiction." Behind him, the dog inched forward, his growl deepening. His sharp eyes darted between the men, his body coiled like a spring. He wasn't just a stray dog. He was a protector, a guardian. "Thomas knew," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "He knew you were after him. That's why he stayed hidden." The leader's face darkened, his amusement fading. "Your husband was uncooperative. He refused to share his findings, insisted on doing things the right way. Unfortunately for him, and for you, that's not how the world works." As he spoke, the dog lunged forward, snapping at the man's legs. The sudden movement startled the group and chaos erupted. Peter shoved me behind him, drawing a small utility knife from his pocket. The other two men scrambled, their flashlights clattering to the ground as they tried to avoid the dog's furious attack. The leader stumbled back, shouting at his men. "Control her!" he barked, gesturing toward me. But the dog was relentless, his teeth bared and his growls echoing off the cavern walls. He darted between the men, forcing them into disarray. Peter seized the moment, grabbing a loose piece of mining equipment from the ground. Swinging it with precision, he disarmed one of the men, who fell back with a grunt. The dog turned his focus to the second man, snapping at his boots and driving him toward the riverbank. I backed away, my heart racing as I tried to keep my flashlight steady. The leader, now separated from his men, glared at me, his eyes burning with anger. "You're making a mistake, Doctor. Morrison," he hissed. "You don't understand what's at stake here." "Maybe not," I shot back, my voice trembling but defiant. "But I understand one thing. You won't win." Behind me, the dog barked sharply, signaling Peter's victory over the two henchmen. But the leader wasn't done. He reached into his coat, and my breath caught as I realized he had one last move to make. The leader's hand moved toward his coat, but before he could pull out anything, the dog lunged again, his growl echoing like thunder in the cavern. The flashlight I held illuminated the scene, a blur of fur and panic. The leader stumbled backward, his composure crumbling under the dog's fierce assault. "Call him off," he shouted, his voice losing its edge of arrogance. But I stood firm, gripping Thomas's jacket tightly. "Where is my husband?" My voice cut through the chaos, no longer trembling but filled with determination. "Tell me, or he doesn't stop." Peter, now standing over the two subdued henchmen, moved closer. "This is over. You've lost," he said, his tone as sharp as the dog's bared teeth. The leader hesitated, his eyes darting toward the dark passage behind him. Finally he spoke, his voice a low growl. "He's alive, but not for long if you keep this up." My heart stopped for a moment, then raced. "Where?" I demanded, stepping closer. "Where is he?" The dog barked sharply, as if urging me to press further. The leader's arrogance cracked under the weight of the situation. He gestured toward the narrow opening we hadn't yet explored. "Through there," he muttered, "but you'll never make it in time." Peter restrained him with a set of zip ties from his pack, his movements quick and efficient. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice steady. "Backup is on the way. You'll be explaining all of this to them." I didn't wait for more words. I turned toward the passage the leader had indicated. The dog was already there, his tail wagging slightly as though encouraging me forward. Peter called after me, his voice tinged with concern. "Ellen, wait. We don't know what's ahead." "I have to," I called back, my voice resolute. "I can't leave him." With my flashlight illuminating the narrow passage, I followed the dog deeper into the cavern. The air grew colder, the walls slick with moisture. The sound of rushing water became louder, filling the space with a relentless roar. My breath came in shallow gasps, fear and hope warring within me. The passage opened into a small chamber, and there, leaning against the far wall, was a figure. His beard was longer, his face gaunt, but his eyes were unmistakably Thomas's. "Ellen?" His voice was hoarse, disbelieving. I ran to him, dropping to my knees as I reached his side. Tears blurred my vision as I touched his face, his hands confirming he was real. "Thomas," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I found you." He smiled weakly, his hand trembling as it reached up to touch my cheek. "I knew you would," he said. "I left the signs. The jacket. Max." The dog pressed close to us, his tail wagging furiously. Thomas reached out to scratch behind his ears. "He never gave up, did he?" "No," I said, holding him close. "Neither did I." Thomas was weak, his movements slow, but his eyes held a spark of life I hadn't seen in years. The dog, Max, now undeniably our guardian, nudged Thomas's shoulder as if urging him to stand. "We have to move," I said, my voice firm yet gentle. "The rain is coming down harder, and these tunnels could flood." Peter appeared in the chamber's entrance, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over his face when he saw us. "Backup's here," he announced, motioning behind him. "Let's get out before this place collapses." Thomas nodded, leaning heavily on me as we began our ascent. Max stayed by his side, every step a testament to his unwavering loyalty. With each movement upward, the echoes of rushing water grew louder, a reminder of the danger we were leaving behind. The rescue team met us halfway up the shaft, their lights illuminating the way out. They carefully secured Thomas in a harness, hoisting him to safety. When I emerged from the cave, the storm had passed, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. The fresh air hit Thomas's face and he paused, closing his eyes as though savoring the moment. "It's been so long," he whispered. I helped him onto solid ground, and Max darted ahead, barking joyfully as he led the way down the mountain path. Behind us, the authorities secured the site, ensuring the villains we'd encountered would face justice. As we walked back to the house, our home, I couldn't help but glance at Thomas every few steps, as though afraid he might vanish again. But his hand, warm and steady in mine, reassured me. When we reached the porch, Thomas paused, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape. "I talk to you every day," he said, his voice soft. "Even when I thought I'd never get out, I told myself you'd find me." Tears stung my eyes, but I smiled. "And you left me everything I needed to do just that." Max sat at our feet, his tail thumping against the porch as though celebrating our reunion. Thomas bent down, scratching behind his ears. "You're a hero, Max," he said. "You never gave up on me." Inside, the house felt alive again. The coffee cups, finally both used, sat on the counter as we sipped, relishing the warmth. Thomas's jacket, now clean but still weathered, hung by the door, a silent reminder of the journey that brought us back together. "1 year ago, Max brought you that jacket," Thomas said, his voice filled with awe. "And now, here we are." I reached out, taking his hand. It wasn't just Max. It was love, determination, and the belief that we'd find each other again. As the sun set over the mountains, Max rose for his evening patrol. This time we followed him, our family complete again. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years we were walking it together. Some mysteries don't need solving, they just need faith, and faith had led us home.